morning. I'm Cheryl Shippentower. I work for the Department of Natural Resources in the Range Ag and Forestry Program for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Reservation. I'm presenting today on invasive species impacts to first foods. First, I want to briefly talk about what first foods are. First foods are traditional foods gathered by the tribes. Although medicinal material and spiritual resources aren't explicitly called out as a first food, they have similar importance. Each first food represents a grouping of similar species. Water is required to produce all the other first foods. Salmon or nasuk represents aquatic life forms. Deer, yamish, represents big games and other wildlife species. And couch or house represents plant greens or roots that are dug. And then wawinu, huckleberry, represents berries. And this first food order is based on the first food promise between Indian people and the first foods. These foods stood up and gave testimony on how they would take care of the Indian people. There was a promise between the first foods and the people, a reciprocity agreement too, that we would take care of each other. So first foods are impacted by invasive species. They threaten first foods that are essential to maintain and enhance tribal traditions and culture. They cause dramatic changes to ecosystems by shifting species composition, biodiversity, and disturbance regimes that are important to sustain first foods. They decrease or eliminate tribal access to culturally important food, medicines, and other uses. Invasive weeds alter the structure and organization and function of ecological systems that support first foods. And I'll provide an example of each and how specific rangeland invasive species are impacting first foods. So first I'm going to talk about annual grasses, and our food gatherers have been reporting impacts for many years to the gathering areas from invasive annual grasses. So annual grasses dominate the rangelands in the western U.S., including the Umatilla reservations. They impact all first foods. They alter soil and water and nutrient dynamics, reduce infiltration, and increase runoff at a watershed level. But today I'm going to mainly talk about the impacts to wildlife and our root crops. So the first thing they impact is the ecological process important to sustain first foods. For example, seed germination and seedling establishment. They alter historical disturbance cycles, hydrology and sedimentation, and also animal productivity. So I'll start out with cheatgrass, which is a winter annual that significantly alters native vegetation, rangeland vegetation composition, reducing valuable forage for wildlife. Native bunch grasses and shrubs have been severely diminished and replaced by invasive annual grasses. Annual grasses influence plant community composition by its effects on the fire regime, leading to more frequent and more intense burns. So you'll see a transition from bunch grass communities to cheatgrass communities, loss of habitat for wildlife, but also the loss of those important plant resources that the tribes gather in those plant communities. Another area that's that invasive species impact is structure, the composition of plant communities. They displace native plants that changes the physical structure. So you'll go from a bunch house community like seen here that supports important root crop luke to a dominated cheatgrass community that no longer supports first foods, root crops, and wildlife. Medusa head is a dominant annual grass on the Umatilla Reservation. The litter is slow to decompose due to high silica content, which also reduces its forage value to wildlife as well as livestock. The silica builds up to 2 to 4 inches and inhibiting seedlings of more desirable species by shading or keeping their seeds from germinating, or even getting the soil contact because of the thatch. So this leads to low plant diversity in these plant communities and a reduction of food plants and other native plants. So you can see from these photos what can happen. It's kind of an open plant community to a thatch that completely outcompetes other species. It also affects organization. These species, they alter the relative abundance of native species through competition, the increased seed production and dispersal viability of weeds. They have faster growth rates, initiate growth before native species. They exploit the soil profile for moisture and nutrients. They have no natural enemies, and they're often avoided by large herbivores. And so I'll transition to talking about invasive forbs that are found on our rangelands here on Umatilla Reservation. Specifically, I'm going to talk about common cupina and sulfur cinquefoil. We also have yellow star thistle that kind of has similar impacts. So I'll be looking at the impacts to, similar to the grasses, impacts to our wildlife and root crops. So sulfur cinquefoil is a perennial forb that invades grasslands and open forests that are similar to other foods that are important to the tribe. So for example, sawick here, there's on top is a meadow full of sawick, and below is a community that's been completely transformed into sulfur cinquefoil. It reduces biodiversity. It becomes a dominant in the plant community. It reduces grass production by about 60%, and due to its high tannin content, wildlife utilization is less than 1%. So not only does it outcompete our plant resources, it also decreases habitat for wildlife. Ina is another rangeland weed that we are dealing with as well. It's an annual forb adapted to many environmental conditions. It's highly competitive for limited soil moisture, and it develops these dense stands that can dominate and reduce biodiversity. So you'll see this site right here used to be dominated by this onion, and now it's completely been taken over by common cupina. So you will have that loss of bunch grasses as well as important food crops. So I kind of want to transition and talk more about how our invasive species management can potentially impact first foods. Indigenous communities can suffer indirect effects from invasive species management. We gather, all our foods from the land. We gather plants for medicinal uses, for basketry, and several other uses as well, spiritual uses. Invasive species management can negatively affect the well-being of first foods and tribal people rely on. During invasive species treatments, you can see a loss in first food species. It can have indirect where it gets into the water system, potentially impacting our water quality and fish and fisheries. So it's really important to get the right training and use the right methods to control weeds so that we can sustain first foods and not impact the well-being of the first foods and tribal people. Tribal people can have an increased risk of pesticide exposure when harvesting and preparing and consuming culturally important foods and medicines and materials. It's important that coordination is developed between the tribes and land managers. Areas should be tribal members should be notified of areas that are being sprayed. They should be posted, letting the tribal members know how long to stay out of those areas so they're not gathering areas that have been sprayed with herbicides or pesticides. A good example is the new herbicide that's being used to treat annual grasses. It has a long soil residual, so it's important to let tribal members know to avoid those areas when that herbicide is present in the soil. So I think it's important when we're doing invasive species management that we take first foods in consideration when treating invasive species. The CTR has developed 2 guiding documents that address the water and salmon. So it's the Umatilla Reservation that kind of focuses on those aquatic species, as well as an upland vision that focuses on wildlife and the other foods, the roots and the berries. So these first food guiding documents describe the desired ecological processes and characteristics for first food resources and proposes management strategies that incorporate the CTR community's values and needs within the document framework. So first foods are taken into account in all this, into the management of this, understanding what ecological processes are important to first foods so that we can maintain those resources. So sustained production of first foods through protection and care of first food habitats allows us to continue to have access to first foods for harvesting, processing, preserving, and sharing. It's critical to the continuation of CTR culture. Without first foods, the continuity of CTR culture cannot be sustained. So it's important that we maintain access to our first foods. So that's managing invasive species, using caution when we're doing invasive species management so that we continue to gather those resources. We're food associated cultures, so there's a lot of teaching and learning that goes in with the harvesting and preparation of first foods. So there's celebration and consumption. So first foods aren't just nutritionally important to the tribe, but they're culturally important to the tribe. We've got that reciprocity of taking care of the first foods if they take care of us. There's the sharing and the caring that goes with that. And it's important for us to understand those first food physical and ecological processes so that we can maintain the first foods. And so I appreciate the opportunity to present today and share about the impacts to first foods and the importance of invasive species management that will sustain these resources. Thank you.